Ravenwood Hospital, perched on the edge of a dense forest, had a reputation for treating the most challenging medical cases. Its imposing stone structure and the thick canopy of trees that surrounded it gave it an air of isolation and secrecy. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had recently transferred to Ravenwood, seeking a new challenge and a change of pace. Little did she know, she would soon find herself in the midst of a nightmare. Dr. Mitchell was assigned to Ward C, a section of the hospital rarely mentioned by other staff. The ward was reserved for patients with rare and unexplained conditions, many of whom had been transferred from other facilities after conventional treatments failed. Her curiosity piqued. Sarah looked forward to the challenge, eager to make a difference. On her first day, Sarah was introduced to Nurse Emily, a seasoned staff member who had worked at Ravenwood for over a decade. Emily was a quiet, somber woman, her eyes carrying a weight of unspoken burdens.
"Welcome to Ward C,"
Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper.
"This place is different, or you'll see what I mean."
The patients in Ward C were unlike any Sarah had encountered. Many of them exhibited symptoms that defied medical explanation. One patient, Mr. Thompson, had a constant high fever that no medication could alleviate. Another, Mrs. Reynolds, experienced severe, unrelenting pain that seemed to move through her body with no discernible pattern. Despite their suffering, the patients were eerily calm, their eyes vacant and resigned. Sarah noticed that the other staff avoided Ward C as much as possible, their faces tight with apprehension when they had to enter. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Sarah sat in the small staff room, reviewing patient charts. Emily entered, looking more troubled than usual.
"Dr. Mitchell,
She began hesitantly.
there's something you should know about Ward C. The patients here, they don't just suffer from physical ailments. There's something else at play, something we can't explain."
Sarah frowned, intrigued.
What do you mean?
Emily glanced around nervously before continuing.
At night, things happen. Patients disappear, only to reappear later with no memory of where they've been. And sometimes they come back different.
Sarah's skepticism was palpable.
Different how?
Just different.
Emily whispered, her voice trembling.
Their symptoms change, sometimes drastically. And their eyes, they look like they've seen something terrible.
That night, Sarah decided to stay late, determined to uncover the truth. She made her rounds, checking on each patient and noting any changes. As the clock struck midnight, she felt a sudden drop in temperature. The lights flickered, and the air grew heavy, with an oppressive, almost malevolent presence. Sarah made her way to Mr. Thompson's room, her footsteps echoing in the silent corridor. She found him asleep, his fever unchanged. She turned to leave when she heard a soft whispering sound, like the murmur of distant voices. She followed the sound down the hallway to Mrs. Reynolds' room. The door was slightly ajar, and Sarah hesitated before pushing it open. Inside, she found Mrs. Reynolds sitting upright in bed, her eyes wide with terror.
"Doctor,
She whispered.
they're coming. They come for us when the clock strikes 12.
Who's coming?
Sarah asked, stepping closer.
The shadows.
Mrs. Reynolds replied, her voice barely audible.
They take us to the other side.
Before Sarah could ask more, the lights went out completely. She fumbled for her flashlight, her heart racing. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating Mrs. Reynolds' terrified face. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and move as if alive. Suddenly, Mrs. Reynolds let out a blood-curdling scream. Sarah turned to see dark, indistinct figures emerging from the walls, their forms flickering like candle flames. They moved toward Mrs. Reynolds, who was now thrashing in her bed, her screams growing louder. Sarah rushed to the door, shouting for help, but her voice seemed swallowed by the darkness. The shadows engulfed Mrs. Reynolds, and in an instant, she was gone. The room fell silent, the oppressive air lifting slightly. Panic gripped Sarah as she ran down the corridor, her flashlight beam dancing wildly on the walls. She reached the staff room, where Emily was waiting, her face pale and drawn.
They took her!
Sarah gasped.
The shadows took her.
Emily nodded grimly.
This is what I was trying to tell you. They come every night, taking whoever they choose. We don't know where they go or why they come back changed.
Determined to find answers, Sarah spent the next few nights researching the history of Ravenwood Hospital. She discovered that the land on which the hospital was built had once been the site of a series of mysterious disappearances in the late 1800s. Locals had whispered about dark rituals and malevolent spirits, but nothing was ever proven. As the nights passed, more patients vanished, only to reappear with altered symptoms and vacant eyes. Sarah felt helpless, her medical training useless against the supernatural forces at play. One night, as she was reviewing her notes in the staff room, she heard the now familiar whispers. She followed them, drawn by a morbid curiosity. The whispers led her to a small, hidden door at the end of a long, dark hallway. She pushed it open, revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. With her flashlight in hand, Sarah descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, she found a large underground chamber filled with ancient arcane symbols etched into the walls. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, stained with what looked like dried blood. Suddenly, the shadows appeared, swirling around her like a living storm. She felt their cold, clammy hands on her skin, pulling her toward the altar. Desperate to escape, she fought against them, but their grip was too strong. As she was forced onto the altar, she realized with dawning horror that the shadows were the spirits of those who had disappeared long ago. They were trapped in this place, their souls bound to the land, and they needed fresh victims to sustain their existence. Sarah's screams echoed through the underground chamber as the shadows consumed her, their whispers filling her mind with visions of unimaginable torment. Her last thought was of the patients, doomed to suffer the same fate. The next morning, Emily found the staff room empty, Sarah's notes scattered across the table. Another name was added to the long list of unexplained disappearances at Ravenwood Hospital. The staff continued their work, haunted by the knowledge that the shadows would return, claiming more victims in their endless, malevolent cycle. To this day, Ravenwood Hospital remains a place of mystery and dread. Those who dare to work in Ward C speak of the shadows, the whispers, and the feeling of being watched, and sometimes on a cold, dark night. They say you can still hear Dr. Sarah Mitchell's screams echoing from the depths of the vanishing ward.